Bulgan is seated with the rest of his squad, savouring the remains of the American tin food they've been provided with when the captain approaches. As those around him spring to attention, their hands instinctively snapping up into a salute, he has little opportunity to do the same, instead caught firmly in the officer's vice-like embrace. But when he is led away from the rest of his men, it becomes quickly apparent to the corporal that there is something of great importance troubling his commanding officer. Having been offered a cigarette, Bulgan listens on intently as his superior speaks to him in deliberately hushed tones, the officer's eyes continually scanning the debris-strewn streets around them for any sign of movement, never once settling to rest upon him. For the last few days, several squads that have been dispatched to clear the ground in and around the city's factory district have failed to return. One of the few structures there which still remains to be swept and cleared is what remains of the Lazur facility, a former chemical weapons factory. Realising what is being asked of him, Bulgan remonstrates with his commander, highlighting how many more patrols he and his men have carried out when compared to others. But when he proposes that perhaps Dolgan should be considered for the task, he is informed that his fellow corporal's team is one of the ones that are now missing. His gaze now focused firmly on his subordinate's face, the captain waits patiently until the last traces of resistance have passed before offering his corporal another cigarette. Despite their fatigue, upon learning the parameters of their mission, Bulgan's men gather their equipment with little in the way of protest. The army is feeding and supplying them well to carry out this task, leaving them largely to their own devices, a very different situation to that which they have previously been used to. Now free from the prying eyes of political officers and commissars, dispatching the shuffling corpses that have infested this city, this has almost become enjoyable to them. So the prospect of something that may present something more of a challenge is on some level almost appealing to these hardy Siberian fighters. It will take nearly half a day, proceeding carefully through the shattered streets, dispatching any of the dead they encounter before they reach their goal, the hulking ruins of what was once a huge chemical factory, adapted to produce deadly weapons in a failed effort to halt the advance of the Nazi invaders. The air seems to sit differently here, presenting as almost heavy, dirty in nature, completely devoid of birdsong or any other kind of animal noise. Keen to keep his people moving, Bulgan divides them into teams, watching approvingly as they fan out into their agreed search pattern. Then, slowly and deliberately, they breach the perimeter of the looming building, hunting for their enemy, be they living or dead, little realising they have now entered hell itself. Almost immediately, the realisation comes that this search will be like no other they have carried out in their ongoing effort to clear the city of the dead. Countless gigantic vats and tanks, which had once held the ingredients for Stalin's wonder weapons, have long since been pierced and broken, spewing their deadly contents forth. The floor of the corpse-like facility is peppered with huge craters and deep shell holes that have gone on to become filled with a lethal blend of toxins and acids. It's as the squad picks their way around these fetid pools that something slowly emerges from beneath the surface of the viscous fluids, somehow unseen by those who have already passed it. Moments later, Michal issues forth a bubbling death cry, his exposed skin seared and burned by the chemical-soaked hands that have now taken a firm grip on him. His dying screams seem to act as a beacon for the gates of hell themselves to open, numerous other seared and burned figures rising up from within the deadly chemical pools. Several more squad members are quickly claimed, as they are unable to defend themselves against the choking odour or the fatal toxic embrace of these hellish creatures. Calling for his men to fall back to what remains of a nearby gantry, Bulgan and the survivors now invite the dead to come and fight on their terms, striking down from the high ground directly into the skulls and faces of their attackers, all the time evading the fatal touch of the acid-covered claws that reach up and out towards them. It's only when they once again descend to the factory floor, the full horror of what has taken place becomes apparent to the Siberians, that what little of the uniforms these corpses wear that was not claimed by the acid pits are identical to the ones that they themselves are wearing. These were their brothers, condemned to a toxic death by their enemy, before going on to rise again in an instinctual effort to add more to their burgeoning number. Wiping back the tears from his face with a gloved hand, Bulgan barked sharply at his men to do the same, to continue their mission, to avenge those who have fallen. The next few minutes passed mercifully by without incident, until Aldar and the pair working alongside him disappeared from sight, along one of the many darkened side corridors. Their piercing screams bring the rest of the patrol running, only for them to fall short of one looming portal, in readiness for whatever threat may emerge. As Bulgan and the others once again draw their blades, several shambling horrors wearing German uniforms emerge. But as the counter blades of the Siberians lance forwards, it becomes shockingly apparent they are having little effect. These horrors, having been seemingly prepared for exactly such an assault. Steel grey helmets strapped securely to their heads, thick black snow goggles affixed firmly across their eyes. The additional layers of winter clothing they seem to have been deliberately dressed in, easily resistant to the steel of the Russian blades. Again forced to order his team to fall back, as two more of their number fall to these muffled monstrosities, Bulgan authorises the use of their sidearms. This is an order he hasn't given since they entered the city, with the risk of inviting the dead towards their position in far greater numbers. But against such a callously engineered threat, he feels he has little choice, desperate to preserve the lives of his remaining boys. Even pistol fire has limited effect, but gradually, by shattering the kneecaps and lower limbs of their opponents, the Siberians gain the upper hand, managing to isolate and successfully strip each of the downed German corpses of their protective layers, before going on to brutally dispatch them. Again failing to hide their sorrow, as Aldar and his stumbling fellows now emerge forth from the waiting darkness, their eyes dead, jaws wide open, with hunger. The next few hours are a waking hell, as the true nature of the battleground they have been called upon to fight is revealed to the men of the patrol. Whilst investigating the remains of an empty storeroom, Madan unexpectedly disappears into a hole, which had been carefully concealed under loose boarding. The two German corpses that feed upon him, similarly dressed in thick uniform layers, as with the others they encountered, are eventually ended with grenades tossed down upon them. Bulad disappears from sight as the roof above him gives way, courtesy of a tripwire he had failed to spot. The falling debris containing three more of the dead, who take time and effort to isolate and eventually dispatch. It's at this time it becomes clear that all of the German undead, who have been adapted to survive the blades and bullets of any attacker, belong to the same military unit. The small badge displaying a rounded cog on the right sleeves of their tunics, suggesting in life they were part of a detachment of mechanics. In his haste to avenge the death of Kunai, who is pulled down through the floor via another concealed hole that contains the dead, Bulgan almost fails to spot his nemesis, loitering at the rear of yet another group of shambling horrors, similarly attired, mimicking their movements, but purposefully hanging back from the carnage. With a rage-filled bellow, the corporal disengages from the fight and gives chase, finally cornering the fleeing figure, swatting away the bayonet it thrusts out towards him, smashing the butt of his pistol hard into the side of the cornered German's helmet, knocking him senseless in the process, before hoisting the now prone figure up onto his shoulder and making his way back to all that remains of his brave boys. The insignia the lone German survivor wears is that of a lieutenant, the faintest suggestion of a beard on his haunted features betraying his young age. The patrol speak no German, just as he speaks no Russian, but the hate in his eyes, which reflects those of his captors, tells the whole of his story. The gnaw marks on the bunched leather belts in his tunic pocket, showing how he covered the mouths of his men after they reanimated, and then set about shielding them from future harm. The scratches and tears to the sides of his greatcoat, where he has pushed or herded them into position, in readiness for when the enemy arrives at their location. Prompted by an overwhelming sense of guilt or loyalty, this young officer has continued to lead those under his command, long after they passed on from life. Waving back the few survivors still living under his own command, snapping at them to sheathe their blades, Bulgan angrily surveys the child before him. recognising in his mind the beginnings of the madness that claimed this boy, asking himself if he too could ever reach a position where he would do the same for his own men. But then the faces of those he's lost fill his mind, both when they were alive and after they had been claimed by this disease, passed on via the bites of those that killed them. With a savage cry, he strikes the youth hard to the face, before lifting him up, shoving him backwards in the direction of the factory floor. His men follow on, as he kicks the prisoner down a gantry, before marching him over to the edge of the acid pits, thrusting the man's face down into the fluid. Whilst only brief, the German officer's screams are amongst the worst sounds they've ever heard, as his lungs dissolve under the choking and burning acid that is drawn into them. Then Bulgan unceremoniously shoves the rest of the body down into the toxic mess, breathing heavily as it disappears beneath the surface, before turning to his speechless charges and reminding them there is still much work to be done.